this series, but of course we couldn't do it without our community partner, Tucson Botanical Gardens, and I'm going to have Ashley come up in just a moment to let you know about some of the happenings at the garden. But this is a true community partnership. How many of you actually attend the lecture series on campus? If you're great. So it's happening right now. It always happens in the spring. I have bookmarks with the whole schedule on the back, on the table in the back with other information. But I just want to point out, much like tonight, we will be doing this talk Facebook Live so people can watch in the moment. We'll also load that on our website for the Science Cafe website so you can watch it at your convenience. And we also have a YouTube channel through the College of Science, so we stash them there. So any and all videos that we recorded are also available there by venue. So it'll be Tucson Botanical Gardens for this group. And tonight is the first in the series of that reflects the Into the Woods exhibit here at Tucson Botanical Gardens. But before I get into that, I will just point out the lecture series is part of one of the major or the core initiatives of the College of Science, public outreach. And so if you're familiar with the land grant mission of the U of A, it's translating and taking that science for use in our communities, including campus community, but the community at large. And so we're delighted to have such a beautiful venue to bring this series. If you're not familiar, we have 4 other venues where science cafes occur, both fall and spring. So there is a brochure on the back table that lists all 5 venues, speakers, dates, titles, and they all have their own theme. But before I continue about our end of things, I'm going to ask Ashley to come up.
Thanks, Erin, and thank you all for coming tonight. This winter and spring, the Tucson Botanical Gardens is celebrating trees. As Erin mentioned, we're hosting an exhibit called Out of the Woods that was put together by the New York Botanical Gardens and the American Association of Botanical Artists. There are 43 works, and all of these images are trees from public gardens in Arboretum all over the country. So after the lecture, we invite you, free of charge, to enjoy the gardens and those exhibits. You can find them in the gallery space just to the right of the gift shop, and also in the Porter Hall, which is a little walk into the garden. So please check that out if you have time at the end. And then the second thing we're doing, of course, is this wonderful Science Cafe series, and all of our lectures now through May come from the Laboratory of Tree Research. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot, and thank you all for being here.
Yes, it's a great partnership. And I'll just mention, if you don't know this series, for the lecture series held on campus, also it's streamed and you can watch at your convenience from the website, and all that is included on the bookmark, but it's Searching for Certainty. I'm delighted that the whole lineup features female scientists. It's rare when you get a whole female lineup, but and they each are pioneers in their field and bring a unique perspective from their discipline. So I encourage you, if you haven't checked it out, this is the 14th year, so there are videos for all 13 seasons prior to that as well. So I encourage you to check it out. How many visited Science City as part of the Tucson Festival of Books? Right, we're now the 3rd largest festival of books in the country, the only one with the STEM outreach. So if you've been to the Festival of Books, you know how massive it is. Science City is 1/3 the footprint of that whole thing due to community encouragement and enjoyment, and we've just expanded over the years. But if you like talks like tonight, hearing about the research that's happening at our Jewel, University of Arizona, the backyard, we have something called Science Cafe, and that's a tent, and this is the flyer for the Science City, and it has a website that lists all 80 booths in 5 neighborhoods, but also a tent where both days, all day, you're going to hear science talks, much like tonight, and you can see the speakers, themes, and descriptions of those talks. Also, how many of you have been to the Mirror Lab in the basement of the football stadium? Right, and Flandreau Science Center and NOAO. We'll have 9 open houses that day, so get tours, hear talks. The exhibits are free and open, and dome shows at the Flandreau Science Center are $5, so they're a steal. And in addition to the Science City flyer back there, oh, I should also mention there's a main stage or science stage. So both days, all day, there'll be national science authors and panels. Also great themes, interdisciplinary, and book signings that go with that. So a nice little city inside of Tucson Festival of Books. And I will mention, let me give you the theme for this lecture series. And as Ashley mentioned, this is unique that we're starting on January 31st, but I bet you're really glad this is balmy, beautiful weather. But the rest of our series will be on the first Thursday of the month, and all those dates are in the brochure, and they do start at 6 p.m. And so our series is called The Wisdom of Trees, Rooted in Science, and as Ashley mentioned, it's in partnership with the College of Science Laboratory of Tree Ring Science and research scientists from there. What we'll do is I'll give the introduction to our speaker, we'll watch the presentation, and then following the talk, we'll allow for some question and answer. And then given if there's enough time, our speaker will stay back for a few one-on-one questions. I am gonna ask, dare I say beg, folks to actually pick up one of our evaluation forms on the back table. Your feedback is invaluable. It helps us know if you're enjoying the series. We give feedback to our speakers, and then we also ask for ideas of topics that you'd like to see, potentially from the U of A. You can also give us your email address. We're not going to solicit to you for anything. We're simply going to send announcements. We do announcements each month of the talks that are coming up, including the lecture series. So that's all we use your email for. But do me a favor, as legible as possible, just so we can be accurate with that email address. All right, and then once we've had a chance to hear the end of the presentation, I'll just make a few more comments before we leave for the evening. And then, as Ashley mentioned, docents Jan and Lois will have a handstand for those of you that like to walk the gardens. So make sure you have your handstand before you walk the gardens. And they do close at 8 p.m. tonight. All right, without further ado, let me get into our introduction. So tonight's speaker, Dr. Don Falk, earned his BA at Oberlin College, his master's at Tufts University in environmental policy, and his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from the U of A, where we reign supreme in that discipline. If you didn't know, we're actually the birthplace of the discipline of ecology, and I'm an alum of that department. Woohoo! He is a professor at the U of A School of Natural Resources and the Environment, with joint appointments in the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research and the Institute of the Environment. He also started and leads the UA's degree in Global Change, Ecology and Management. And he was co-founder and executive director of the Center for Plant Conservation, originally at Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University, and now at San Diego Zoo Global. He is founding board member and first executive director of the Society for Ecological Restoration, and he was also a delegate to the 2015 UN Climate Summit in Paris, and he's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Don's research focuses on fire history, fire ecology, and the development of the theory and practice of resilience ecology in a rapidly changing world. And I asked Don to give me a couple tidbits about him personally, because it's really important to know the people behind science, right? He shared that he loves to backpack and is working on hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. Go Don. In case anyone wants to come along. And his daughter thinks he tells the worst jokes ever. Without further ado, please join with me in welcoming Don Falk for his talk, Restoring Ecosystems in the Climate Change Era.
No, really, the worst jokes ever. So I just want to begin by thanking UA Science and the Tucson Botanical Garden for this invitation. I got here a little early and took a walk, and I almost didn't come back. Just such an extraordinary place. We've been watching this garden develop, and it's such an oasis of diversity and beauty. So I'm really honored to be here. And secondly, I'm completely honored to speak to all of you because you chose to be here instead of staying home and watching the previews for Game of Thrones, for example. So you're my kind of people. Winter is not coming. So I'll say one more thing about this talk, and that is that we're going to go into the dark a little bit and then come back out. And I'm just telling you that there is that kind of arc of this talk, so that if you think we're just going to go into terminal depression and then I'm going to leave you there, don't worry. So we are going to come back out, but in order to appreciate the end of the story, we have to go through the beginning. And so my beginning is forests.
Would you be a little closer to the microphone?
I'm sorry, thank you. How's that?
Much
Better?
better,
Okay,
thank you.
thanks for speaking up. You know, riffing on the title of the series, are we out of the woods yet? And I would say no, but neither are we completely lost in the woods. So I spent a lot of my youth getting lost in the woods in Pennsylvania and then New England, and then started going to the Sierras. And it's really one of the places I feel most comfortable. So when we say trees, I think forest. And I don't think that I've ever been in a forest that didn't just completely stop me in my tracks for its beauty and complexity. So that's kind of my personal starting point, not just intellectual, but a deep emotional attachment. And forests have this extraordinary range of climate settings that they can occur in. This is a climate space diagram, and you don't have to worry about the nerdy details, potential evapotranspiration on this side, how fast water is lost, and annual precipitation and humidity. But what we can see is that forests have a kind of climate niche, and it's pretty broad. And it ranges all the way from boreal cold forest to wet tropical forest to dry tropical forest. There's a tremendous amount of diversity. I'm not, of course, tonight going to be able to speak to how we're restoring all those different kinds of forests, but I will say that there are some certain common principles that seem to be emerging as we watch our forests go through climate change. Forests also store the vast majority of carbon among terrestrial ecosystems. They cover more than 4 billion hectares. If that number even means anything to you, it's really hard to even get your head around that. And forests also bail us out to the tune of about 1/3 of our carbon emissions every year. So as a thought experiment, a world in which forests were greatly diminished or absent entirely, our contribution to global greenhouse gases would be 33% larger. So they play an incredibly important role, and for all the work that they're doing to bail us out, I would say we're not treating them very well. Here's another picture just following that point on the carbon stock, because there's an interesting observation here. So this is, I see that I'm sort of going in and out of the mic. Is it all right? Okay. So this is essentially the amount of carbon stored, not the annual income and outflow, but how much is stored in forests in these different areas. The green is above ground biomass. The charcoal gray is below ground. And what I want you to notice is that the amount of carbon in the Eurasian forests, these would be the great boreal forests of Eurasia, the amount below ground in soils is greater than the above ground biomass in South America. So this reminds us that with forests there's a lot more than meets the eye. We tend to think about the above ground part because that's the part easily seen and quite honestly easily studied. Below ground ecology is very, very difficult to do. But this is a reminder that in conserving forests, there's a lot more at stake than simply that above ground portion. And in fact, the below ground carbon is probably the biggest single tipping point factor that people are concerned about. Forests are also the home to a very high proportion of human, cultural, and linguistic diversity. And so all I'll say for now is that as forests are lost or altered or degraded, human culture is also lost or degraded. And this is a very serious issue. Thousands of languages have been lost just in the last 20 years, languages, in fact, language families. And so this is the human side of the question of maintaining forests and why it's important for us to do so. So, kind of the background, and just ask then all of us to think about kind of your early experience in a forest and compare that to now. And so the question is, what do we have in front of us? What has changed? So it will be no surprise that I'll begin by addressing climate change. And in fact, are we allowed to give homework? Okay. I'm going to give three homework assignments, actually. And this will all be on the exam. The first is the National Climate Assessment. It's the most recent national assessment of the climate factors and current and present and future climate for the United States. You don't have to read the entire thing. There is an executive summary, but it's really quite good. Many of the authors who contributed to the National Climate Assessment are not only from UA, but several of them will actually be speaking in this series, so I recommend it very highly. And then Naomi Klein's book on climate change, if you haven't read it, a little more polemic, but also really, really good reading. And the main take home from these is, as a climate activist said a few days ago, we should be acting like our house is on fire, not like we have a century to figure this out. So, in fact, as we now start to look at the particular aspects of climate that are changing that affect forests, one way we can do that is by looking at changes in the distribution of precipitation and temperature. The dark charcoal gray dot points here are the 20th century averages, annual averages for rainfall and temperature. The gray points are the end of the 21st century, our current century, modeled temperature and precipitation. And what jumps off the page for me is that there's almost no overlap. We're moving into a completely different domain. Now, these are model results. Models can be wrong. I'll say in general, these kinds of models have been quite good. They're quite good. If there's any uncertainty, it's what we are going to do as a society in terms of limiting our greenhouse gas emissions, not the details of the model. So this means that the forests we see today, which over most of Western North America originated, for the most part, no earlier than the 1600s, although there are individual areas that have older forests. The vast majority of forest we see is on the order of 400 to 500 years old. That grew up during a much cooler, wetter period, portions of which are sometimes referred to as the Little Ice Age, although it may not have felt like that at the time. But these forests are originated in a very different climate from the climate they face in just a few decades. And so the question of this transition is really quite pressing. One way we can quantify the problem that forests are facing is by asking a question about drought stress. Drought is a particular kind of stress for forests, and it's really compounded when it's added with high temperature. We get a quantity called the vapor pressure deficit, and that you could just think of that as combining the effects of soil moisture and heat and low atmospheric moisture. So it's the evaporative stress on trees. So as this index of drought stress goes negative, that means it's harder and harder to be a tree. And there have been episodes when this drought stress was very negative, but what's stunning is what's happening, what's projected to happen to this index over the coming century. Now these are data from tree rings for the Southwest United States. So this is not, this is a regional estimate of the actual drought stress that we're going to be facing. How do we put this number in context? It looks bad. By the way, the black curve is the instrumental measured data. The red curve is a model based on tree rings and then projected into the future based on future climate models. How do we contextualize this curve? Well, the dotted line is the drought stress for the 5 worst droughts in the last 1,000 years. And so what you can see here is by the middle of the century, not only are we very droughty, we are essentially permanently below, we are permanently in worse drought than the worst 5 episodic droughts of the last 1,000 years. This would suggest that many forests, as we see them, simply are not going to survive based on climate stress alone in the Southwest. Remember, I told you, bad news first. So this creates arguably the greatest scientific and management challenge of our time. And I will say that when I entered the field of ecology, and earlier than that in the work that was described in conserving rare plants, and before that, the idea that there would be a single unified problem facing all of science and management was really not on the table. There were so many different things going on in the world that any one of them could have been arguably the preeminent problem that we had to address. Now, for better or for worse, all of biological conservation, all of restoration ecology, and much of the natural sciences are focused on this single, central, convergent problem of climate change. It cannot simply be overstated. This is both a challenge, but also an opportunity, because it means we have an opportunity to collaborate with scientists from multiple disciplines, and I think you'll hear this as a recurrent theme during this series. We're all working on different aspects of the question of how to keep life going during a period of climate change. So we tend to focus, as I have for just the first few slides, on changes in the climate system itself. And I imagine for most of you, graphs like this have now become second nature. You see them all the time. There was certainly a period when this was kind of odd and weird, and who's thinking about the climate system, other than climatologists. But we all know, for example, that the carbon concentrations and temperature by the end of this century are very much under our control. Again, each of these envelopes represents a certain amount of model uncertainty and different variables being put into the models. But the main uncertainty between now and, let's say, AD 2100 is how much is facing us. And this leads to your second piece of homework. This is the IPCC 1.5 report, so-called. It was released last fall. It's a special report of the IPCC, which is the scientific workhorse of the international climate change community. And they did a special report on 1.5. Why 1.5? Because that was the target stated during the Paris climate negotiation as the level below which we need to keep global temperatures are already warming faster. But if we can keep the change to 1.5 degrees C or below, we stay out of the worst changes. Again, you can read the whole report. I won't hold you responsible for the whole report, but you should at least read the executive summary. And what it basically is a roadmap to how we can do this. And the good news is that it's doable. It would take a serious act of will and consensus on the part of every nation in the world to pull this off. But it is actually achievable, and I just want to keep coming back to that nothing I'm going to say today means that it's game over. We just have some very difficult challenges, and in fact those challenges are getting a little bit worse week by week as we delay and defer. So you may see images like this that show our annual emissions tapering off by the end of the century. And that, of course, is the goal that we have in front of us, to bend that curve and to get it, if possible, into the negative emissions territory. But the story is more challenging for forests than that, because we have a growing population. The oceans are absorbing a tremendous amount of the impact of human society, as you may have heard recently. And a variety of factors conspire to such that even if we start bending the curve at 2100, global temperatures stay high for centuries. The outer line here is AD 2300. And so you can see this is an uncomfortable thing to look at. I hate looking at this graph. It means even if we start controlling our emissions right away, a certain amount, in fact a substantial amount of global climate change is already in the atmosphere and it's already in the oceans, and extraordinary measures would have to be taken in order to reverse that. This means that for conserving forests, it is not a matter of years or decades. We need to be thinking how to conserve forests centuries out under conditions of altered climate. I bet Game of Thrones preview is starting to look pretty good right now. Okay, so this, of course, brings us to the ecological change when ecosystems and with species and populations and ecosystems are confronted with changing climate. How do they respond? And we know through the abundant evidence in paleoecology throughout hundreds of millions of years that ecosystems have moved around tremendously and species have moved around tremendously. They've also evolved in order to adapt to new climates. And so the idea of a changing climate does simply not mean that no species is going to be able to survive. But it is interesting to see that even under the current projections, there are winners and losers. For example, the panel on the left, this one here, this is Engelmann spruce. How many of you have been up to the top of Mount Graham or the Pileños? Okay, the rest of you really should get out more. That's, you can barely see it, but there is actually a little pixel on this map that is the Pileños, and that is pretty much the southernmost extent of Engelmann spruce in, sorry, that's the current map. And you can see by the end of the century, under a moderate climate change scenario, it's pushed far to the north. It's lost a lot of its range and it's been displaced. Does that mean that Engelmann spruce goes extinct? No, absolutely not. It simply means that it's going to have to get from where it is to where its climate will support it. The series on the right is a species of mesquite, prosopis. And as you can see, it's actually delighted to move into areas that were not colonized before. So I don't mean here to put any kind of happy face on the problems of climate change, but it is a fact that species have moved around throughout the history of life, and they will be doing so this century. The question will be, is what we call the climate of velocity so rapid that species can't keep up? I'll say just in passing that some ecological changes are perhaps reversible in a different way. For example, the die-off in coral reefs. They are facing a much more difficult change because of the changes in temperature and ocean chemistry that really call into question their viability under future conditions. And because of where they live in the oceans, it's unclear whether they have the same options as, say, forest trees or birds or mammals. So we're already seeing the direct effects of these changes in the climate. And I want to begin here to make a contrast with the main theme that I'm going to look at. So are we seeing climate change effects already? Well, as of last fall, in the preceding 10 years, there are 129 million trees that have died during that period in the Sierra Nevada. It's like that 4 billion hectare number. What is 129 million trees? So here's a map of the, here's Fresno, here's the town of Sonora. So these are the Sierra Nevada. These are the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. And what you can see is that those red pixels are areas where a high proportion of the trees in that area have died. So this mapping goes on every year, and I check in with my friends, and once a year, sort of like, okay, what's the bad news now? And the number keeps going up. This is direct climate impact on tree survivorship. So we're seeing already the leading edge of that tailing off curve that I showed earlier, where forests are simply dying. They cannot cope with the moisture stress. And in fact, in a study by a colleague that looked at a number of old growth stands, more than 80% of these were showing signs of drought stress and elevated mortality. So I think we can say to any of your friends or relatives or colleagues who are still not sure that this is really such a big deal, or maybe it's decades into the future, it's happening now. It's absolutely happening now. The thing that I want to put on the table is even more cheerful, although it's a very complex phenomenon, and that is how what we call disturbances, wildfires, insect outbreaks, processes of that kind, complicate this whole picture. The reason for that is that unlike climate change, which unfolds over many decades in most cases, maybe even a century for the impacts to be felt, large wildfires can change an ecosystem literally overnight. And once that happens, that system, as I'm going to show you, can go off on a completely different trajectory, and it can do so very, very abruptly. So what I'm going to argue is that it's the interactions of climate change, which we're all thinking about, and wildfires, which we're thinking about, but mostly in more limited settings, such as the fires that have happened in California in the last 2 years. It's those interactions that really are the game changer. And so we're going to explore this question more closely. So, of course, we're hearing about these fires because they're impacting human communities in tragic ways. Not only firefighters, but civilians, people like us, are losing their lives. Prior to the last couple of years, the worst episode of that was in Portugal. 2016, when more than 60 people lost their lives. So this is beginning to bump up against human society in a very tragic and uncomfortable way. So when I talk about the effects of wildfires, I'm going to speak especially about what we call high severity wildfires. These are fires, or portions of fires, where a large proportion of the trees and possibly shrubs have been killed. The soil has also been severely damaged. There's often a tremendous amount of erosion post-fire. This is an image that I took following, during the tail end of the 2011 Las Conchas fire, which is the largest fire ever to burn in the state of New Mexico in historical times. And this landscape is just devastated. There is pretty much no topsoil. The trees are all gone. I was out with a colleague, we had binoculars, and he, at one point, very excited, said, "There's a tree over there," and it was about probably 2 kilometers away from where we were standing, unlikely to help the watershed that you see here. So if you look at this picture, you can see that this is a very different kind of damage from what we would get from climate. Climate doesn't do this. Wildfires destroy the very fabric of an ecosystem, and that's just one reason why things go off in a very different direction. So the question then is, climate, we'll posit, is everywhere. But what about wildfire? Is there enough of it to actually matter, or is this just a kind of special circumstance? So I'm going to begin by showing a series of slides from the Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico. How many of you have been there? Valles Caldera National Preserve? Oh, come on. Okay, maybe a field trip in conjunction with this. Okay, well, I will say the Valles Caldera National Preserve is one of the most spectacular natural areas in the western United States. It's a huge grassland. You'll be sitting on Highway 4 with your binoculars looking at these tiny little specks, and you realize it's a herd of elk, a giant herd of elk. Just a fabulous place. So these are the Jemez Mountains, the homeland to many of the northern pueblos in New Mexico. And each of these following panels represents the fires that burned in that decade. So if you watch this number up here, these are the fires that burned, an outline of the fires that burned in the 1970s. And then these are adding to that the fires that burned in the 1980s, a couple of big ones. 90s, kind of quiet, one big fire. 2000s. Anybody know what that was? That's the Cerro Grande fire that burned into Los Alamos and almost sent our national stockpile of plutonium up into the atmosphere. Wouldn't that have been interesting? So that was the Cerro Grande fire, which everybody thought, okay, that's as big as they get. Until 2011. Thank you for gasping, right? So the picture that I took was right down here in the middle of this. In the middle of, I should add, a 30,000 acre contiguous high severity patch. So this is what we call a black dragon fire. The fire behavior is simply not predicted by the behavior models we have. The size, it seems to make its own weather, it seems to grow itself. We've seen events like this all over the world. And then 2013, kind of the last big event there, this is the Thompson Ridge fire, which actually, for what it was what we call a good fire. It behaves the way fires are supposed to behave. So you can see in this one large mountain landscape in the southern Rocky Mountains that about more than a third of that area has burned in just a few decades. So this suggests that fire has had a significant impact here. What about elsewhere? Well, here's the Sierra Nevada, southern Sierra Nevada, and these are fire polygons, same as we just saw for the Jemez Mountains, since 1983 when the Landsat satellite, the first Landsat satellites became operational. And so you can see here, these are like a jigsaw puzzle. They really fit together. In fact, there are very few areas in this part of the Sierra Nevada that have not seen fire in the last 30 to 40 years. And on the right is the national map. That's a lot of fire since the 1980s. The surprising case for me, I just had to look at this to really believe it was correct, is Alaska. Okay, dare I ask, how many of you have been to Alaska? Wow, okay, I see what you're doing with your time. I have not been to Alaska. I will trade you my trip to Alaska for your going to the Valles Caldera National Preserve. Deal? Okay, deal. So check this out. Look at the Central Valley in Alaska. These are fire polygons that go back into the 1950s, so a slightly longer period, about 60 years worth of data. But what is 60 years in the life of a forest that lives 600 years? You begin to see my point, is that fire actually is quite, cumulatively speaking, is quite an important presence on the landscape. It's been underestimated in terms of the area that it affects. Lastly, let's zoom back to California and ask the same question for California. So on the right is a map of the kind of broad vegetation types in California. The green are forests and woodlands. The brown is agricultural. The tan are deserts. So kind of get the shape of that green, which is kind of everything that we would call forests and woodlands. And now I'm going to show you all the area that has burned in California since 1950. It's pretty much that green polygon, right? I mean, a few areas, maybe up in Northern California, have not gotten hit so far, but that, of course, could happen at any time. And so, again, we have to come to the conclusion that, yes, climate is everywhere, but some of these other disturbances, like fire, and there are similar data for insect outbreaks, are very ubiquitous. They are ubiquitous on the landscape. And therefore, if we don't understand how climate and fire interact, we're missing a huge part of the question of what challenges forests are facing and how they will adapt to the future. We did a paper recently asking what wildfire looks like moving into the future, right? Based on same kind of climate models, we calibrated wildfire area burned in 1,500 grid cell pixels because we know that climate and fire interact differently in different topographic and geographic settings. And I'll just draw your attention here to this area in the interior west, which shows increases of 2 to 6 times the average amount of area burned by the middle of the century. So the take-home message here is, first of all, fire has already been a ubiquitous presence, and can we say it's simply not going away? It's not going to go away. So in order to keep our forests going through this very stressful time, we need to be thinking not only about climate, but about these other disturbances, wildfire and insect outbreaks. So fire, zooming down now kind of more to a landscape level, fire leaves what we call ecological legacies. A legacy in the ecological terms means something that persists through generations or through time. It can be a physical legacy, it can be an informational legacy that is the product of evolution. Fire leaves a lot of legacies like this, and they're not necessarily bad. You can see here, for example, this fire in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in New Mexico killed a patch of trees, but it doesn't seem to have caused the kind of soil damage that we saw in the Las Conchas fire. And in fact, there's a lot of surrounding forest around this patch, and it will probably recover just fine. This was a high severity fire, but it has all the earmarks of the fire that this forest is adapted to recover from. So what we're concerned about then are what are called ecological tipping points. And what we mean by this is that you may have, let's say, a grassland which experiences fire and then recovers very, very quickly, in fact, possibly even the next year, or a slightly longer loop, that blue loop of that picture that I just showed you from the Sangre de Cristos, where the forest will, in fact, recover. It may take decades. It might even take a couple of centuries, but it will come back as a forest. So what we're concerned about now is tipping point behavior. And the characteristic of a tipping point is that once you go past it, you're in a new domain, a new ecological domain. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. And once you're in that new domain, the system is resilient in its new space. Furthermore, those new domains are somewhat unpredictable. After a big disturbance, like a big wildfire, like that Las Conchas, that watershed in the Las Conchas, it could go to a shrubland, it could go to a grassland. Parts of it might even come back to a forest, but a different kind of forest what was there. And once you're there, once you're in this alternate state, it's very difficult to get back to where you were. So these tipping points have this property of irreversibility. Here's an example, also from New Mexico, the Pecos Wilderness. This was a mixed conifer forest before a fire in the early 2000s. It was all pine and spruce and fir, Douglas fir, and a big mortality event happened. After the fire, this hill slope, this watershed recovered on its own. There was no planting. and it recovered into Gamble oak. Gamble oak is a good card-carrying native North American species. It's very drought tolerant, it's fire resistant. It has captured this site. And if you crawled around, as I did for just one day, looking for any sign of seedlings of the pre-fire conifer dominance, you're not likely to find any because Gamble oak, once it captures the site, really holds on to it. And there are innumerable examples of this, where the post-fire community is very resistant to going back to its previous state. So this would be an example of a tipping point behavior. All right, so reaching the inflection point now. So the challenge confronting us, and I'm just showing pictures of some of our friends and relatives here. The challenge confronting us is how much of what we have grown up accustomed to are we going to be able to see through this very difficult period? And you would honestly get a very different answer from, say, a primatologist or a temperate forest ecologist like me. Very, very different answers and very different solutions. So how do we get through this period? What do we have in front of us that we need to do? And this is where we are essentially rewriting the field of restoration ecology right now as we speak. The restoration approaches that were appropriate and applicable when I started in the field, when the Society for Ecological Restoration was founded in the 1980s. Those rules are being rewritten right now for the reasons that I've showed you, because if you simply try to go back to a past environment, whether it's tipping point behavior or the climate envelope having moved, it's not going to work. You're not going to be able to go back to that past state, especially once these big, severe disturbances have happened. So there are new strategies that are emerging, and this is kind of the state, the very dynamic, volatile state of restoration ecology right now. It's a fascinating time to be in the field. So we can, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I'd be happy to talk further with any of you about these different strategies. The first one is promoting resistance or persistence. We're still always going to try to keep what's there alive, and that's because of that legacy effect. So if we can keep, for example, high severity fire out of an old growth forest, by all means, let's do that, because it gives it a better chance of persisting at least up until the climate envelope makes it untenable. The second strategy is what we call recovery. So when there has been a mortality event, when there has been dieback, when there has been a big fire, some of those forests can be brought back. And again, that patch that I showed you from the Sangre de Cristos, that's an example where we think recovery is possible. It's not too far gone. And then the last strategy, which is the most highly debated, and we can call that reorganization. And this is where the ecosystem is going to morph into something else, where we, in fact, as restoration ecologists, assist it in becoming something else. Now, many people in the restoration field argue about whether that is restoration at all, or whether we're giving up on the core principle, hey, we are restorationists, we're not engineers creating something that's never existed. But as I'm going to show you, there are many, many cases where this kind of reorganization is actually the most adaptive pathway and gives us the best prospects of having functioning ecosystems in the future. Part of the evidence for the ability to do this comes from close observation of how species adapt to climate change themselves. So the points on this map are for single leaf pinon, Pinus monophylla, and the numbers, if you can read them there, are the years when that species was first observed at that point. And if you can't see them, I realize the type is a little small. These early numbers are in the 10,000s. They were during the last ice age. That was the refugium of single leaf pinon. And the numbers get smaller and smaller as climate warms and pinon migrates to the north, following this adaptive climate envelope dispersal that we talked about earlier. What's really interesting to me is these most recent sightings, which are 300 to 400 years. So on its own, single leaf pinon only got to that area of north central Nevada just in the last 300 to 400 years. Its ability to disperse and keep up with climate. So this should be encouraging news. This would suggest that at least some species can keep up with the velocity of a changing climate. And of course, what hangs over that question is whether species will be able to keep up with the accelerated climate velocity that we are imposing. This applies to mammals like pika that have to migrate upslope. And again, it applies to many, many species where the primary challenge is, can they keep up with their climate envelope? This suggests a new mission for restoration ecology, which is helping species not necessarily stay alive where they are, but helping them move where they need to be. Now again, I will say very clearly that to many people, this is a controversial and almost heretical idea that we are going to restore things by putting them somewhere else. That just seems to rewrite the rules. But the fact is, I think many of us are coming to the conclusion that we have no choice. The climate envelope is shifting. As I showed at the beginning of the talk, it's not a temporary shift of a few decades. It's going to last centuries. And these ecological disturbances also may make it impossible for species to persist where they are. But the good news is this is a skill set that we have. People have been restoring ecosystems actually for thousands of years. If we look at the cultural practices of many indigenous cultures around the world, the modern practice of restoration ecology, the modern science, goes back into the mid-20th century. But we know how to do this. And in fact, there are many inspiring examples of restoration projects right here within a couple of hours of Tucson. So the ability to help species keep up with changing climate relies on a skill set and people and dedicated communities that exist. This means that we don't have to invent something new, we simply have to apply the skills of restoration ecology where they're most needed. An example of this would be prescribed burning. You probably know that prescribed burning is one way of reducing the fuel loads, which if they accumulate, create these huge mega fires. I'm sorry to say that raking is probably not as effective. But let's keep it in the mix, just to keep everybody happy. Prescribed burning is very inexpensive relative to the cost of a giant wildfire. And by the way, I skipped past this, but the cost of the California wildfires this year and last year combined are somewhere on the order of $350 to $400 billion. That is 1.5% of our entire GDP. So even if you could care less about forests or tree huggers or ecology, that's a lot of money. Prescribed burning puts fire back in the landscape in a much healthier way. And in fact, it's already happening. This is, I argue, well, maybe one of you will prove me wrong. This is the 2011 Miller Fire. It burned in the Gila Wilderness in the same year that the Las Conchas Fire burned. If any of you are from Sierra Vista, same year as the Monument Fire that blew through the edge of town. This is, I think, the largest 88,000 acre that nobody's ever heard of. But now prove me wrong. Did anybody know about the Miller Fire? Okay, all right, okay, yeah. So this was a good fire. This did exactly what it should do. Why was that possible? Because the Gila Wilderness allows fires to spread. They don't suppress every single fire that begins. And there are structures and roads and infrastructure in the Gila. There's some areas that they have to protect. But in comparison to most areas of forest, the Gila is a place where we can have free-ranging fires. The Rincon Mountains, am I pointing in the right direction? Yeah. Rincon Mountains behind us are another one of those areas where, relatively speaking, fire is allowed to do its job. And the result is that you have not had catastrophic fires in the Rincons the same way we have had in the Catalinas. That's a legacy of fire suppression. Same thing for the Miller. So we know how to do this. We simply need to let nature do it. The other thing that's really interesting is that in restoration ecology, it's not as if we have to invent the species response. We simply have to understand how species and communities recover from disturbance. I had the good fortune to travel in Iceland last fall and spend some time with restoration ecologists in that very dynamic place. And if you ever want to see an example of a place where nature is having to reinvent itself and having to recover all the time, this very dynamic Icelandic landscape is a great place. And you see examples like this all the time where the first colonizers are creeping onto the volcanic rock that's left from the most recent eruption. Iceland is always reinventing itself. But there are mechanisms here that we didn't have to make happen. So nature knows how to heal itself. Our job is to help it in the ways that it can heal itself. Here's a series of pictures illustrating this point from the Chiricahua Mountains. These are pictures taken by my colleague Jim Malusa. And these are repeat photo points that he took beginning in 2010. This was supposed to be documenting recovery from the 1994 rattlesnake fire. Instead, that was a pre-fire image for the 2011 Horseshoe 2 fire that burned essentially the entire Chiricahua mountain range. And so you can kind of pick out a feature there, like those trees over on the left. Still there, not looking so great. But let's keep winding forward. 2014, system seems to be recovering. We're not necessarily back to a forest, but there's a lot of diversity there. 2016, and actually, there's the limb of a conifer right there coming back. So surprisingly, you would have written this area off. You would have said, okay, that is just newt. And the recovery is actually surprising. In fact, Jim was out this year. I didn't have time to put his new pictures on, but it continues to recover. So what I want to emphasize here is that nature has these deep reservoirs of ability to heal if we don't push it too far. And even when we push it into a tipping point, what we're going to get is not a moonscape. It's just going to be something different. Now, if you're a forest guy like me, then the loss of forest is a tragedy. But it doesn't mean that there's not going to be anything alive there. It simply means that it's not going to be what it was, and it probably will not have the carbon capturing ability that forests do. In some cases, these kind of broad brush prescriptions that I'm describing are not going to work. I'm showing here two examples that are famous in not only the conservation community, but the tree ring community. These are giant sequoias on the left and bristlecone pine on the right. And the reason I put these up is that these are cases where the individual trees have names, right? They literally have names. And so this is not like an anonymous mixed conifer forest where it's just kind of a swarm of trees, and we love trees, but we don't know any of them individually. These are individual specimens of global importance. They've been protected, they've been studied, they've provided very long scientific records of fire, climate change, and ecological processes. And so what is the future for the giant sequoias? Recent work done at the University of California suggests that the climate envelope for a giant sequoia is moving away from where the trees are. So I'll ask you a question that I sometimes ask a conservation biology class. So 3 possibilities. One would be set up a watering system, maybe some shade cloth, just do anything to keep them alive where they are. The second would be to collect the cones and start planting them out ahead of the curve where climate is going, and you won't have these 3,000-year giant trees, but you'll have giant sequoia. And the third is just to stand back and let it happen. So how many of you choose option 1, that is kind of maintain that environment where they are? Don't be shy. Okay. Oh, all right. We'll let you get away with that this time. All right. For those of you who split your vote, or either, how about option 2? Fascinating. And how about option 3? Yeah. Okay. We had so heartless. So what I want to tell you is that you have the same profile as a bunch of 18-year-olds in conservation biology classes. That should be good news. I always thought, oh, they're just, they don't understand how gorgeous these things are. But you see the dilemma, and this is I'm not making this up, this is a real dilemma facing the managers of Sequoia National Park. How are they going to keep these giant treasures, individually known, alive during this period of rapidly changing climate? Okay, this brings me to one of the most extraordinary moments of my life, which was being in the room when the 2015 climate agreement was gavelled closed. We were just looking at the movie of this the other day, and honestly, every time I watched that movie, I almost started to tear up. It was extraordinarily emotional. 195 countries, any one of which could have stopped the agreement, as you may know. Nobody did. And so we had a global agreement. And let's remind ourselves, by the way, that the US political climate around climate, if you will, is very different from the rest of the world. Not only Western Europe, but most of the rest of the world accepts that climate change is real. We are really quite an outlier, and unfortunately we're also the 400-pound gorilla in the equation. So it's not inconsequential that we're out of step, but we really are out of step. So what does this Paris Agreement have to do with my topic today? Well, first of all, this was the first, the IPCC report that led up to the Paris Climate Agreement was the first time that the contribution of forests to maintaining the terrestrial atmosphere, terrestrial biosphere, atmosphere carbon balance have been quantified. And the number that was put to that is on the order of 1/4 of all global emissions caused by burning or degradation or destruction of forests. That is a very large number. So most people, and most of us probably, when we think about stopping climate change, we think of tailpipe emissions, right? Electric cars and better light bulbs and smaller houses and stopping burning coal. Those are all true. But it turns out that how we treat the biosphere, and in particular forests, is a very part of that equation. And in fact, this IPCC report concluded that the 1.5 goal, which is your second piece of homework, remember, cannot be met without turning around the degradation of global forests. So this now is no longer simply something we're doing because we love forests, even if you don't give a whit about forests. The fact is you cannot solve the global climate equation without taking care of forests, and in particular, maintaining their ability to sequester carbon. Forests, therefore, are not simply receivers of climate. In the beginning of the talk, I kind of presented them as the victims, if you will, of climate change. And they are, they absorb the impact. But they also modulate the climate system itself. And there's a lot of exciting work at University of Arizona, I think you may hear about during this series, showing how not only forests are affected by climate, but how they influence the climate system itself. Again, the good news is we know how to do this. We have the knowledge. We understand what it is that needs to be done in order to reverse the degradation of forests. There are some very big, important programs, such as a program called the Bond Challenge, where every nation in the world set a target for restoring forests for the purpose of capturing carbon. And then a program called RED+, look it up, which is focused especially in tropical areas, and it's particularly focused on trying to prevent the degradation of forests that have been impacted by things like overcutting in the Amazon or palm oil conversion in Indonesia. Okay, your last piece of homework. This is the fun one, but you don't get to do this until you've read 1.5, sorry. This is a great compendium of climate solutions. If you want to feel like you just cannot take any more bad news, and believe me, I think me and all my friends in climate change, ecology, sometimes it's just too much. You just have to say, okay, I get it. Drawdown was initiated by Paul Hawken, who's a very well-known entrepreneur, and he and his team put together 100 solutions to climate change based on existing methods or technology. So this is not like the dream scene kind of stuff. This is things that could be done now. For every solution, they costed it out, they looked at how it could be scaled up, and they asked how much carbon can this sequester from the atmosphere. And when you add up everything in the book, of course, it gets us below 1.5. But what's surprising to me and what I love about this book is the way they went out of the box. So some of the, on the right is a pie chart of broad categories of how much carbon could be saved. This is changing our food system, what we eat. This is land use, and this is women and girls. Maybe for my money, the most surprising chapter in the book is how much impact equalizing our society on a global basis would have in terms of balancing our relationship with nature and our relationship with the atmosphere. This is really, really worth reading. It will change the way you think about climate change, and I believe it will give you hope because it shows solutions that really can be implemented. Okay, so wrapping up, there are a couple things I just have to say. The first thing is that all of us in the developed world, we have to remember how different our lives are from the world that most of the people live in. Most of the world's population lives in lives that are beset by serious poverty, famine, and war. And so, we don't tend to think of ourselves as the 1% because our perspective is our own society. But in fact, if we step back and take a more global perspective, we realize how fortunate we are, and also how much we are contributing to the climate problem. People sometimes say, when we go through this idea of implementing all these measures, that's simply too expensive. We can't do that. We can't restore all these forests. We can't do prescribed fire. We can't implement all the ideas in drawdown, even though they're all costed out and ready to go. We just don't have the money. So I pulled up this pie chart from that well-known radical organization, the Office of Management and Budget, and asked, so what are we doing with our money? And not to put too fine a point on it, but that largest slice is our military expenditures. Every other slice in the pie, environment, education, diplomacy, everything that would actually bail us out are these tiny little slivers. And so I think if somebody, including any of your denier friends, says, well, that's too expensive, we don't have the money to do that, not realizing it's going to wreck our economy, it's not so much a question of whether we have the money, but how we're spending the resources that we have. So my takeout messages for you, and I call them takeout because they're not really good enough to take home, so eat them in the car. First of all, climate really does change everything. It is reworking the entire field of ecology and all the natural sciences. It's also going to completely convert our economy, whether we like it or not, in large part during our lifetimes and certainly by the end of the century. Second, it's hard to integrate it's hard to internalize this, but we have to understand that we are at the beginning of centuries of change. Even if we begin bending our annual carbon emissions, the cumulative greenhouse gas and the cumulative changes in the ocean are centuries out, and so we have to think about much longer term than we have been previously. Third, for the specific question of how we keep nature going, there's a real trend toward restoring what we could call resilience or adaptive capacity, rather than necessarily always fixating on the historical moment. And this is as much by necessity as by desire. This is the only way to help ecosystems keep up with changing climate. And lastly, I think we've seen, and the IPCC has confirmed this now, and our experience confirms it now, that not simply standing by, but restoring forests is actually not only something we want to do because we love them, but it's essential for reversing global climate. Thank you very much.